Right here are some of my original Pokemon cartridges that I've had since I was a kid. Now, even though they're really just pieces of plastic and hardware, the thought of someone stealing or harming these cartridges absolutely terrifies me. I mean, there are objectively way worse things that could happen to me than losing these video games. Someone could take my social security card and proceed to ruin my entire life. Yet, that thought doesn't fill me with the same existential dread as losing my Pokemon games. Even though it's literally my identity, I feel no personal attachment to my social security card. It's just a piece of paper with some arbitrary numbers that has no sentimental meaning to me. But something about holding this Game Boy with Pokemon Red in my hand just brings out this weird vulnerability in me. It just takes me back to that feeling of sitting in the backseat of my parents' car, playing without any sort of care in the world whatsoever. If I were to lose this, it'd feel like I'd lost my childhood innocence itself. In 2019, Pokemon Sword came out. I bought it, played it for maybe 30 minutes, and then proceeded to put it on my shelf and never touch it again. When Arceus Legends came out, I bought it, but couldn't even be bothered to take the plastic wrap off of the game. And my copy of Scarlet and or Violet is invisible, because I don't even own them. Clearly, my love of Pokemon only seems to exist in the space of the games that I grew up playing. Some might say this is because the franchise has seen a dip in quality over the years, and let me tell you, there is no shortage of YouTube videos explaining this phenomenon. So maybe the games do suck now, but I wouldn't really be able to tell you. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I didn't even bother playing them. And who knows, maybe I would have really enjoyed them. I mean, just looking at some of the new Pokemon designs, some of them look pretty cool. Compare Koraidon, this super colorful and unique looking dragon from Generation 9, against Geodude, who is literally just a rock with arms. I think it'd be pretty fair to acknowledge that Koraidon is the more interesting Pokemon design. But if you had to put a gun to my head and ask me to pick between the two, I'd pick the rock with arms any day of the week. And this holds true for even modern editions of older Pokemon. Pikachu used to be this awkward, chubby little guy with stubby T-Rex arms. The current day take on the character is a lot more clean. He's slimmer, his colors are brighter, and he just gives off more of a mascot type energy. But emotionally, it does very little for me. Something about the old Pikachu with his watercolor and low resolution just is much more of a vibe. Now, I definitely identify myself as a fan of Pokemon. I've played most of the games multiple times, own Pokemon books, clothing, I even have a life-size plush of one of my favorites. So as a self-proclaimed fan of Pokemon, why do I find myself so eager to talk about and revisit these old games while having very little interest in exploring the new ones? According to the publication Nostalgia, Past, Present, and Future, researchers define nostalgia as a self-relevant and social emotion that's often triggered by a negative effect, such as loneliness. Nostalgia straightens social bonds, increases positive self-regard, and generates positive affectivity, suggesting its role as a psychological resource in coping with negative emotions and enhancing well-being. Basically, our brains are wired not just to remember events, but also the emotions tied with those events. And when you're feeling a bit sad or lonely, nostalgia can kick in as sort of a defense mechanism. Reminiscing on some of the good times from your past will kind of trick your brain into also feeling the positive emotions tied to those events. It's the mental equivalent of eating ice cream when you're feeling bad about yourself. Now, what we're nostalgic for is going to be determined by what we associate with comfort and happiness. It can be a person, it can be a place, or it can be media. Take, for example, Pokemon. Growing up as a pretty shy kid who considered leaving the house a pretty scary endeavor, a game where you adventure through an unknown world with your loyal companions just inspired so much wonder in me. I mean, the whole thing felt so grand and exciting, but it was also safe. I mean, it fit right directly in my pocket and I could pretty much play it anywhere I wanted. And if I found another kid who played Pokemon, then we could pretty much instantly be friends because I could talk about it endlessly. Memories from battling and trading with my friends is still something that's brought up to this day on the regular. Pokemon just gives me this almost indescribable feeling of happiness due to all the fond memories that I have with it. And let me tell you, those positive memories have definitely translated into monetary purchases. Nostalgia is a very powerful emotion, so if a brand can get you to associate some of that positivity with what they're selling, well then they basically have a stranglehold on both your brain and your wallet. So is my love of Pokemon just a ploy by a bunch of suits trying to get me to shell out everything in my wallet? Basically. But I like to think there's a little bit more to that equation since not everything can stand the test of time. The Star Wars prequels were something that I absolutely adored as a kid, but as I got older, their flaws became a lot more apparent to me. These days, those movies are not something I'm very interested in watching, and if they do happen to be on, then it's hard for me to view them with a non-critical lens. Other media can age like fine wine, and you'll gain a deeper appreciation for it over time. Super Smash Bros. Melee is another game that I played a lot during my childhood, and as a kid it was mostly just a fun party game that I would play with my friends. But as I grew up, I learned how deep and intricate the mechanics of Melee actually were. These days, my perspective on Melee has completely changed. I don't see it as a kid's party game anymore, I see it as a work of art that deserves to be taken seriously. Another good example of this is Avatar: The Last Airbender, which has made a huge resurgence in popular culture recently. The same people who enjoyed it as kids are now able to grasp the deeper themes and character development that were always there but just maybe went a little unnoticed when they were younger. But to me, Pokemon exists in this weird middle ground. The games, or at least the ones I've played, have never soured on me, and I find myself happy to revisit them from time to time. So at its core, I do think these games have some merit that is worth being nostalgic for. But I guess if I'm being honest, I wouldn't really consider Pokemon high art either. In the vast landscape of RPGs, there are definitely games with better stories, more intricate gameplay mechanics, and way better looking visuals than Pokemon. I don't think what I'm about to say is a very hot take, but Pokemon is a pretty simple game that doesn't really challenge the player on a gameplay or thematic level. But when I play these games, it's not for the gameplay or the story, it's really more for the mood or vibe that it puts me in. When I was a kid, it was that sense of adventure and wonder, but now that I'm a little older, it's a bit different. Now it's kind of a bittersweet feeling, almost like watching an old VHS tape. There's beauty and simplicity in the way that it captures a time that no longer exists and may never exist again. If you've dabbled in psychology, you might be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Essentially, this is a tier list that ranks what humans need to be both happy and fulfilled. At the bottom of the tier list, we have basic physiological needs such as food, water, and shelter. But these days, most of us aren't too worried about getting eaten by cave bears, so we usually start at the second tier of the hierarchy, which is safety and security. Humans like to experience some sort of order and predictability in our lives. Knowing that we'll have a job when we wake up, or knowing that our friends won't ditch us the first chance they get, gives us a sense of control or a feeling of agency in our lives. Throw some instability in there, and we start to feel anxious and distressed. However, whether we want it or not, uncertainty is just a part of the natural world, and change is just an inevitable part of life. At some point or another, most of us are going to have to face changes in our surroundings, our careers, and even our relationships. It's a pretty common experience to have people that you're close with in your life, but over time, you all kind of drift apart. Or locations that may have felt like home, but over time, they become completely unrecognizable to you. Now, media is kind of unique here. It can of course evolve through direct continuations of the work itself, i.e. sequels. And if someone has really strong positive associations with a work, and then you go and fundamentally change that work, well then it does provide a risk to that need for safety and security in a way that's not too dissimilar from losing a friend. Whether you enjoyed them or not, I think we can all agree that the newest Star Wars trilogy from Disney had a very visceral reaction from fans. Disney's movies wrote continuations for plots and characters from the original movies. So if you didn't like those additions and changes that they made, well then your understanding of the original trilogy might have been soured as a result. Star Wars and its characters were a fundamental part of a lot of people's childhood, so to see it morph into something so different and unrecognizable can almost be interpreted as a personal attack to anyone who didn't like the outcome. But there is another side to this coin. Even though everything in the world is changing around us, a work of media will, at least in isolation, continue to exist in the same form as when it was released. If I were to go watch Star Wars Attack of the Clones right now, it's technically the same movie that was released in 2002. I stated earlier that I'm not really a fan of the prequels anymore, but the reason I'm no longer a fan of the prequels has nothing to do with continuations of the work changing my understanding of those movies. Instead, it's the interpretation of these movies and the values that I project onto them that's shifted over time. Put a different way, Star Wars didn't really change, I changed. That brings us back to my relationship with Pokemon. You see, throughout my life, I've seen people grow apart and places that used to feel familiar become completely unrecognizable, and most of this was through little to no action of my own. Control is somewhat of an illusion, and once you recognize that, it can feel like life is just this constant tide that just pulls everybody along. Yet, with all that being said, these Pokemon cartridges are still here running the exact same game that I experienced when I was a kid. And I mean, sure, the curtains have been pulled back a little bit, and it turns out that these pixelated monsters aren't actually staring back at me. Would I say that I still get that childlike wonder when playing through these games? Not really. If I want to tap into that sense of adventure, well, these days I usually have to chase that experience through grander means, which ironically involve actual travel with my friends and family. Exploring new and unfamiliar places with the people you care about is, funnily enough, what Pokemon was always geared to replicate. Walking through the streets of Kyoto with my lifelong friend felt eerily similar to the first time I explored Johto. And even though these games don't quite hit that note anymore when compared to the real thing, I do find them acting as almost a time capsule for what that felt like. They serve as a reminder of simpler times and as a guide to finding that same inspiration through new experiences. Almost like an anchor that allows me to tap into that childlike innocence when maybe I feel like I need it. In a weird way, the save files on these games contain a part of who I used to be when times were just a little bit less complicated. Playing the newer games might just overwrite some of that nostalgic magic, which is not something I really want to take a risk on. So yeah, my view on Pokemon these days is a bit more raw. I more or less see these games for what they really are and have no intention of playing the newer ones. But at the end of the day, when the real world is constantly moving without any intentions of stopping, it is comforting to know that the world of Pokemon still fits right in my pocket.